into the 8th chapter. So if you'll remember, the Israelites had attacked the city of Ai and been thoroughly defeated. And Joshua was a little dismayed, and he found out that there was sin in the camp. And the Lord told him what needed to be done to take care of the situation. And that's kind of where we are here in verses 24 and 25. So we'll finish up with this. Like I say, hopefully move on and get quite a bit into chapter 8. Before we go any further, I'd like for Doc Akers, if you would, to lead our minds in prayer. All right, so let's look at verses 24 and 25. And Joshua and all Israel with him took Achan, the son of Zerah, and the silver and the garment and the wedge of gold, and his sons and his daughters and his oxen, his asses and his sheep, and his tent and all that he had, and brought them to the valley of Achor. And Joshua said, Why have you troubled us? Jehovah shall trouble you this day. And all of Israel stoned him with stones and burned them with fire after they had stoned them with stones. So basically here we see the discipline that God had prescribed was pretty much the death penalty, not only for Achan, but also for his family and all of his possessions. And that was the way that God chose to get all of the sin out of the camp. Now it was a little unusual here in this situation. In Deuteronomy 24 and 16, the Mosaic law expressly forbids the putting to death of children for the sins of the father. The situation here, though, is a little bit different, probably for a couple different ways. Number one, I think it can be gleaned from the situation that where the bounty was hid. It would be pretty hard for the children and the rest of his family not to know what had happened, since he buried it right there in the middle of the tent. So if that be the case, then they were an accessory to the sin that had gone on. The other situation is here when you look at Deuteronomy 24 and 16, what the reference here is punishment of ordinary criminals. This was like a civil type of law and a civil type of criminal punishment. But what we have here is a little bit different situation. And this command didn't come from the law of Moses. This command came straight from the word or from the mouth of God. So, since God is the giver of the law, then God has the ability to apply the law the way that he sees fit. So it doesn't matter, what the reason was. The thing here was that God completely purged the sin from the camp, and it's kind of like when you do surgery, you got to get all of the problem, and then you try to get a little bit of the problem around it to make sure that the problem is completely gone. So that's kind of the situation here. He cleaned out the whole group and everything that was associated with it, so that there would be absolutely no doubt in the mind of anybody that God hadn't taken care of the situation. So it's a terrible punishment, but it's also a terrible thing to not do the things that God told you to do. Comments about those verses? This guy took these things and he knew not to take them. And maybe nobody else saw him, or maybe they tried to keep it secret. God knows today our thoughts and the intents of our heart. And this should be a lesson as far as I'm concerned, to know that what God has got on his mind. That's right. Absolutely. Any other comments about those verses? All right, let's look at verse 26. And they raised over him a great heap of stone to this day, and Jehovah turned from the greatness of his anger. Therefore, the name of the valley is called the Valley of Grief to this day. So, this piling up of stones is called a cairn. And this is something that is common. It was common in that time, both for great people and also for eminent culprits and criminals. And it was a reminder to the people. They knew what these different things meant, and it was a reminder to them of either good things or of bad things. And it's my understanding that this is still customary in some parts of the Middle East that they do this. So the valley in which Achan suffered his punishment, now they received the name of Achor, which means troubling. And Joshua was talking about how he was troubling God and how he was troubling the people, and of course he got troubled. He got troubled also. So this is a reference and probably something that that Joshua had a little bit to do with, and the people gave him this name. So I want to kind of sum up this chapter. Adam Clark had a really good summation of this chapter, and I think it sums it up very well. And he wrote, "From the whole of this account we may see exceeding sinfulness of sin and the great danger of notwithstanding its first approaches. By covetous many lives and many souls have been destroyed, and yet the living lay it not to heart. Who fears the love of money, provided that can get riches? Through the intensity of this desire, every part of surface of the earth, and as far as possible its bowels, are ransacked in order to get wealth. And God alone can tell, who sees all things, how many private crimes, frauds, and disseminations this gives birth to, by which the wrath of God is brought down upon the community at large. Who is an enemy to his country? The sinner is against God. An open foe may be resisted and repelled because he is known, but the covetous man who, as far as his personal safety will admit, is outraging all requisitions of justice, is an unseen pestilence sowing the seeds of desolation and ruin in society. Achan's covetous, which led him to break the law of God, had nearly proved the destruction of the Israelite camp, nor would the Lord turn away his displeasure till the evil was detected and the criminal punished." And I think that's a pretty good summation of the chapter here. And there's obviously some lessons that we can learn from this particular chapter.
It's interesting how in that verse God's justice has been appeased. Because what does he do? What does the last verse says? That his anger turned away. It was sad. The justice was satisfied.
And then we're also going to see in chapter 8 here that he's got the children of Israel back on the course, and he's back on their side. So let's look at chapter 8 here. When the people had dealt with the sin that God had commanded, now Israel was ready to go and engage the enemy. So what we're going to see here in chapter 8 is we're going to see the victory over the city of Ai. And in the last chapter we saw the defeat. Now we're going to see what happens when God's on their side and the things are done in accordance with God's word. So let's look at the first two verses here. "And the Lord said unto Joshua, Fear not, neither be thou dismayed. Take all the people of war with thee, and raise up, and go to Ai. See, I have given unto thee thy hand of the king of Ai, and his people, and his city, and his land. And thou shalt do to Ai and her king as thou didst to Jericho, and her king. Only the spoil thereof and the cattle thereof ye shall take for prey unto yourselves, and lay thee an ambush for the city behind it." So we see here that in view of Israel's defeat, God's encouraging words were necessary to strengthen Joshua's resolve. He had to build Joshua back up a little bit because in the last chapter, Joshua wasn't doing too good. And being human, there was probably a little bit of doubt in his mind of what was going to happen here in the future because they had disobeyed God. So God, right off the bat here, tells Joshua, don't worry about it. Don't fear. The iniquity is in the past. It's not going to be a problem. And God is back on the path here, and He has already turned His hand against the city of Ai. All Joshua has to do is follow the directions that the Lord gives him, and they're going to have the victory. We also see here that God not only guarantees the victory, but in this case, He's going to specify the strategy that's going to be used to defeat this city, because it's different terrain, it's a different situation than as far as a tactical standpoint that it was there at the city of Jericho. So he talks here about taking the men of war. Now we know from our further study that the men of war were the men who were over 20 years of age. So we also know from the previous parts of the book that Joshua had about 40,000 men of war at his disposal, which we talked about before is about 4 divisions in modern day terms. So Joshua was to do basically the same thing, a complete destruction of Ai, just like he had a complete destruction of Jericho. Destroy everything, kill everybody, kill all the animals and things along that line, kill everything that needed to be killed in accordance with God's will, and then also to kill the king. The difference here is that at Jericho, they weren't allowed to take any spoils with them, but here they're going to be allowed to take some booty and some spoils, the cattle, those types of things that weren't destroyed. They're going to be able to take some of it back with him. However, in order to conquer the town, he was going to have to lay an ambush behind it. And we're going to see here as we go through this chapter a very interesting military strategy. And looking at this is a strategy that has been used in modern times to defeat enemies. So I was reading this, and several battles came to mind as I was reading this. Comments about those 2 verses.
Seems like at this time, to me, everything that happened, everything that transpired was because of war.
Mm-hmm.
If their obedience, he caused them to lose battle. And everything they did to make that right was because so they could go back to war and win the battle.
That's right.
Seemed like all they cared about at this time was fighting.
But that was the lifestyle back then.
God told them to take this land, and that was their main objective.
That's right.
That's all they did was fight.
Right.
God told the things in Jericho belonged to Him. God should get His part first.
Absolutely.
Now,
good point.
People are getting their part.
Right. Good point. All right, let's look at verse 3. So Joshua arose and all the people of war to go up against Ai, and Joshua chose out 30,000 mighty men of valor and sent them away by night. So this time, Joshua selected 30,000 warriors, which is about 3 divisions. Now, if you remember the last time, they only sent about a brigade to try to defeat the city. This time, they're going to go in with the proper force. God is sending the proper amount of people. He's providing the strategy this time. So they departed from at night to get into position so that they could not be detected. They didn't have night vision goggles and all the stuff we have now. And basically back then, wars were fought during the day, and they weren't fought at night. But what we're seeing here is, God directed that the force that's going to be off to the west needed to depart at night so that they would go and get in position undetected. So, we're going to see here that Joshua is going to be very closely commanding this particular operation. He's right there in the field with the troops. He's not in some headquarters back behind the lines. He's right there on the front lines. Comments about verse 3. All right, let's look at verses 4 through 8. And he commanded them, saying, Behold, ye shall lie in wait against the city, even behind the city. Go not very far from the city, but ye all be ready. And I and all the people that are with me will approach into the city, and shall come to pass when they come out against us as the first, we will flee before them, for they will come out after us till we have drawn them from the city. For they will say, they flee before us as at the first, therefore we will flee before them. Then ye shall rise up from the ambush and seize upon the city, for the Lord your God will deliver it unto your hand. And it shall be when ye have taken the city, that thou shalt set the city on fire according to the commandment of the Lord. Ye shall do. See, I have commanded you. So here Joshua is laying out the operational order for his troops. He's going to send about 5,000 of his warriors off to the west. Size-wise, this is kind of like about the size of a reinforced brigade. So he's sending, a decent amount of people off to the west. And then the remaining 25,000 are going to be positioned right there in front where the people there of Ai can see them and see them organized there. This is the classic thing that Patton used to talk about: hold them by the nose and kick them in the butt. That's exactly what he's getting ready to do here. He's going to pull these people out of the city far enough away. He's going to bring in this brigade in behind to destroy the city. And then when the men of Ai figure out what's going on, they're trapped. They've got this huge group in front of them that's 3 times the size of what they have. And then they're trapped because they can't go back to the city because they've got forces behind them. So this is going to be a complete annihilation of the army there.
It's also a good evidence of their strategic retreat.
Right. The other battle that this reminds me of is the Battle of Cowpens in the Revolutionary War. And what happened there was that General Morgan sent the militia out in front of the regular army. And the British had absolutely no respect for the militia. So they had to go out in front, and they were ordered to fire 2 volleys and then retreat. So, the British, they saw these 2 volleys. They saw them retreat, so they took off after them. And then right behind it was the American force, and they just wiped the British out. That's pretty much what Joshua is doing here. The same deal. He's drawing these people out because you got to think about it. The people of Ai, they just whipped these people here not too long ago. So they have absolutely no respect. They say, there are a bunch of chickens here. They went like the last time, and this is what's going to happen to them. So basically, after drawing out the men of Ai, the attackers are going to reverse course, and then they're going to wipe out the men of Ai. So what we're going to see in the rest of this is kind of a recap of how the battle went. He gives them the operational order in these first few verses. Now what we're going to see is we're going to see the battle take place, and we're going to see how this plan that God put together, how well that it's going to work. Any other comments before we move on to verse 9? All right, let's look at verse 9. Joshua therefore sent them forth, and they went to lie in ambush and abode between Bethel and Ai on the west side of Ai. But Joshua lodged that night among the people. So Joshua sent his strike group, his brigade, off to the west to get into their position that night. So they would be there at first break of dawn, ready to go. But he stayed with his main body of the army. He was there to direct them in the affairs, because this was going to be kind of a tricky maneuver. Okay, so he was right there to lead them. He's he was a good leader. He was going to talk to them a little bit more, how they needed to act, how they needed to behave, how the battle was going to go, and to give them confidence in the things that they were going to do. And when they came to fight, he was there to inspire them, and with his courage and his confidence, that they might not be afraid of the situation. This kind of reminds me of George Washington. One of the things that made George Washington such a successful leader was he was always went to the sound of the gunshot. And George Washington obviously had a very inexperienced army, and he was always right there at the tip of the spear to make the decisions necessary and to inspire his men. He led from the front. And that's basically what we see here with Joshua. He was there inspiring these people. He was going to be there to lead them from the front. Comments about that verse? All right, let's look at verses 10 through 13. And Joshua rose up early in the morning and numbered the people, and went up, and he and the elders of the Israel before the people to Ai. And all the people, even the people of war that were with him, went up, drew nigh, and came before the city, and pitched on the north side of Ai. Now there was a valley between them and Ai. And he took about 5,000 men and set them to lie ambush between Bethel and Ai on the west side of the city. And when they had set the people, even all the host that was on the north of the city, there lie in wait on the west of the city, Joshua went that night into the midst of the valley. So he gets everybody in position, and he puts his main force in plain view of the people of Ai. In old-fashioned military action, this was called a demonstration. And what he was doing is he was putting his force out there so that the people could see what was going on, and plainly see that this was the children of Israel. Let the people of Ai put their battle plan together. Of course, we know what their battle plan was, because the Lord had told the children of Israel what their battle plan was going to be. He knew what was going to happen, and he set everything up in position, ready to go. And then we see that at night that Joshua went down into the valley, and he basically spied it out, reconnoitered it himself to make sure that he knew the layout and that everything was going to be ready. Joshua, if you read all the way through here, he didn't leave things to chance. He was a very attention to detail type of person. And this is another thing that a good leader does before a battle, is they go through and they survey the land to see where the problems are, where there's an opportunity to exploit the things there of the land. And going back to this area and the Civil War, this is one of the things that made Stonewall Jackson such a great general. He had a guy that all he did was went before him and make maps. As a matter of fact, it was the same guy that laid out the Norfolk and Southern line through West Virginia after the war. And this is showing that what kind of leader that Joshua was. He had his people in place. He has surveyed the land, and he had done everything militarily that was supposed to be done. And more importantly, he was following the directions that God had given him. And as long as you follow the directions that God gives you, you're going to be successful. And I think Joshua understood this probably more than anybody in that group. Comments about those verses? All right, let's now look at some more verses here. Let's look through, We'll read a little bit here. And it came to pass when the king of Ai saw it, that they had hasted and rose up early. And the men of the city went out against Israel to battle, and he and all his people at a time appointed before the plain. But he wist not that there were liars in ambush against him behind the city. And Joshua and all the Israel made as if they were beaten before them, and fled by the way of the wilderness. And all the people that were in Ai were called together to pursue after them. And they pursued after Joshua and were drawn away from the city. And there was not a man left in Ai nor Bethel that was not out after Israel. And they left the city open and pursued after Israel. And the Lord said unto Joshua, stretch out the spear that is in thy hand toward Ai, for I will give unto the land. And Joshua stretched out the spear, and he had in his hand toward the city. So here we see that Joshua is starting to put the plan into action. He goes out there. He starts to attack the city. The army there of Ai, plus the we talked a little bit about the Canaanites that kind of grouped together, maybe had some mercenaries or something along that line there to help them. They drew every one of the fighting people out of the city and left it completely undefended, because they were confident that the children of Israel were going to flee just like they did the last time. So the children of Israel start to retreat. The men of Ai, they start to pursue. And when they get to the proper distance away, that the ambush that's coming in from the west could go in unobstructed, then Joshua was to do what the Lord said, and he was supposed to stretch forth his spear. Now, this was going to be the signal for the brigade that was coming in from the west to go in and start to attack the city. And it was also the signal for the battle to start to take place, where they were going to reverse course. And then these three divisions, they were going to go back and attack the people of Ai. The scholars estimate that based on the size of the city, that they had between 3,000 and 4,000 defenders. So we've got 25,000 versus 4,000. And that's kind of that 3-to-1, 4-to-1 advantage that we talked about last week that you're supposed to have when you attack the force. So Joshua is following the directions of the Lord. Everything is working the way that it's supposed to. It's supposed to work up to this point. Comments about those verses? All right, let's go back to verse 19. And the ambush arose quickly out of their place, and they ran as soon as he had stretched out his hand, and they entered into the city and took it, and hasted and set the city on fire. And when the men of Ai looked behind them, they saw, and behold, the smoke of the city ascended up to heaven, and they had no power to flee this way or that way. And the people that fled to the wilderness turned back unto the pursuers. So here, at the proper time that was given by God, they went in and they started to destroy the city. They set it on fire. They started killing everybody. And here's the men of Ai. Boy, they're going right after the children of Israel. And then all of a sudden they turn around and they look, and their city's on fire. And I think at that point they probably figured out that they'd really messed up in this situation. The problem was, it didn't matter that what they knew. They were trapped. They couldn't go back. And being outnumbered 3-to-1, I would suspect what happened was, and this is a speculation on my part, that probably when the children of Israel withdrew, the middle withdrew first, and then the sides kind of withdrew and walked God around, so they completely surrounded the men of Ai. That's a classic thing that, and it happened a lot in battle of that these pincer movements, going around and getting in behind your enemy. So, but the plan worked perfect. The men of Ai got sucked right into this battle, and they were utterly destroyed also, along with their city. So, true to God's word, the plan worked, and the things were happening just the way that God said that they were going to do it. Comments about those verses? All right, let's go on to start back at verse 21. And when Joshua and all of Israel saw the ambush had taken the city, and that the smoke of the city ascended, then they turned again and slew the men of Ai. And the other issued out of the city against them. So they were in the midst of Israel, some of it on this side, some on that side, and they smote them, so they let none of them remain or escape. So we see here that now the rout has been completed, and all of the attackers had been, or all of the defenders had been killed, and this was God's will that that this happened. Comments about those verses? All right, let's move on to verse 23. And the king of Ai they took alive and brought him to Joshua. And it came to pass, when Israel had made an end of the slain of all the inhabitants in the field, in the wilderness therein, they chased them. And when they were all fallen on the edge of the sword until they were consumed, that all of the Israelites returned to Ai and smote it with the edge of the sword. And so it was that all that fell that day, both men and women, were 12,000, even all the men of Ai. So they knew from that there was about 12,000 people there, and there was an accounting, and they made sure that everybody had been slain. But we've still got one left that hadn't been slain, and that was the king. And he was going to get some special treatment. And this was typical of how things were done in that particular time frame. So this was a conventional battle fought by rules rules of war that they had back then, not necessarily the rules of war that we have today, but this was the way that things were done. And it's like Philip said, they had plenty of practice in doing this. Comments about those verses? All right, let's look at start back with verse 27. Only the cattle and the spoil of the city Israel took for a prey unto themselves, according to the word of the Lord, which he had commanded. And Joshua burnt Ai and made it a heap forever, even a desolation unto this day. So basically, the city was completely destroyed. It was torn up, and it was left in a heap. And obviously, that was a reminder to the people of that day that of the power of God. And it's my understanding that even to this day, the city of Ai had never been rebuilt. They'd done some excavating there, and they had a hard time, the way I understand, even finding it. It was so thoroughly destroyed. And some of these other little towns that are mentioned here, there's no archaeologist evidence of it. Other comments about that verses? All right, let's go to verse 29. And the king of Ai he hanged on a tree until eventide, and as soon as the sun was down, Joshua commanded that they should take his carcass down from the tree and cast it in entering the gate of the city, and raise thereon a great heap of stone that remaineth unto this day. Then Joshua built an altar unto the Lord God of Israel in the Mount Abel. So we see here that, they took the king out and they hanged him. And probably considering some of the things that they had done, that was done to other kings of that time, probably the king was happy to be hanged instead of some of the other things that they had done to kings in that deal. So he was out there pretty much for everybody to see. And then when it was nighttime, it was ordered to be taken down. They took him back into the city, and again they built a cairn over top of the king there to remind the people of what happened. And it says that it was there and until that day. Then we see here in verse 30 that Joshua built an altar to the Lord, and there was going to be a sacrifice and praise to the Lord for the things that had happened. Comments about those verses?
There's actually a Mosaic command about why the body was taken down. You go back to the 21st chapter of Deuteronomy, verses 22 and 23, and it reads, "If someone guilty of capital offense is put to death, and their body is exposed on a pole, you must not leave the body hanging on the pole overnight. You should bury it the same day, because anyone who is hung on a pole is under God's curse."
Very good. Let's look at verse 31. "As Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded the children of Israel, as it is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of whole stones over which no man hath lifted up any iron. And they offered thereunto a burnt offering unto the Lord, and sacrificed peace offerings. And he wrote there upon the stone a copy of the law of Moses, which he wrote in the presence of the children of Israel. And all of Israel and their elders and officers and their judges stood on the side of the ark, and on the side before the priests, the Levites, which bear the ark of the covenant of the Lord, as well as the stranger as that he was born among, half of them over against Gerizim, and half of the other against Elba, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded before, that they should bless the people of Israel. And afterwards he read all of the words of the law, the blessing and curses, according to all that is written in the book of the law. And there was not a word of all that Moses commanded which Joshua read not before all the congregation of Israel, with the women and the little ones and the strangers that were conversant among them." So we see here that Joshua took this opportunity to give the Lord the proper thanks that was commanded by the Lord. And then, he went back to the law of Moses, and he reminded all the people all of the things that the Lord had put in the law. And that had to have had an effect on these people, because they had seen what happens when they disobey the law. And now they see what happens when they obey the law. So he's taken this opportunity to remind them of all of the things that God had told them to do. I'm sure he also reminded them of all the blessings that the Lord had given them, and all of the things that had been done for them on their behalf in the past, and hopefully in the future, and reminded them how important it was to follow the law. So any comments about that chapter? So Bill, you can start with a fresh chapter next week, chapter 9. Appreciate everybody's attention and comments today.